Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the mornings. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It's Friday, November 21st, 2025. We reached the end of the week, and the president wants you hanged. So, happy Friday. How's your chaos level? Boy, what a fun way to end the week. I know this had already happened, I think, by yesterday, and I don't know. Did it happen early enough for us to make mention of it? I mean, do we really want to make mention of it at all? Come on, it's just par for the course, right? Just another day in Trump world. But yeah, right. I think we did make mention of it, that he had been using his Truth Social. Right. Yeah, I think by the end of the show, first he had re-truthed, as they stupidly say. I mean, what else are you going to say on it? It's all stupid terminology. That he had reposted somebody else's call and then eventually clarified for himself by saying, yes, please hang everybody. And then, of course, they had to ask Caroline Leavitt about that at the White House press conference, and no. He does not want to execute members of Congress, it is said. However, he does think it's seditious behavior for them to be saying things like, members of the military who are instructed ordinarily under the Uniform Code of Military Justice not to obey illegal orders should, in fact, not obey illegal orders. And that makes Trump mad because I want to give illegal orders and I want him to follow them, and it's not right. So, it's causing a bit of controversy as we pick over whether or not it's in fact legal to tell people not to do things that are illegal. Typically, it has been the case that you can do that and you should do that, but I don't know. Today, maybe not. I also need to actually Google this while we're on trying to get the show started to find out what is the status of the hate crimes guidance, I guess, in the Coast Guard, because yesterday the news was that the Coast Guard would no longer be classifying swastikas and nooses as hate symbols, and it was pointed out by a couple of people. It was a fairly obvious comparison. That is an interesting announcement to make the day that President Trump starts posting that he wants to hang people. Okay. Well, it's not out of hate. It's more out of sorrow than out of hate that he wants to hang all of you. So maybe that qualifies. And it was interesting to see the Coast Guard looking to reclassify swastikas as potentially divisive symbols, because it's very difficult sometimes to tell the difference between a hate swastika and a unity swastika. But I guess it must be out there, and we'll have to parse that as it goes along. But then I saw this morning something that sounded like it may have been a reversal of that policy. So, it's Friday chaos as promised. Yeah. So as I looked it up in the AI destroying the world machine, one offering, I mean, really this would have been the case, I guess, prior to AI giving you your search answers. It's just that much more annoying now that it is. One offering, the top offering, Washington Post goes with the headline, but this is 9 hours ago. U.S. Coast Guard will no longer classify swastikas, nooses as hate symbols. And I didn't even realize that the comma was a hate symbol, but this is a new entry. But the Daily Beast, which is from 1 hour ago, and is, of course, a beast, says Trump's Coast Guard backtracks on swastika policy after uproar, which, I mean, I guess it could mean we backtracked on our policy of classifying swastikas as hate symbols after an uproar by Nazis. But I think it's the second interpretation, or the first interpretation we had before, that they are, in fact, aware that most of the world found that to be a rather disgusting policy to implement, and they're backtracking from that one. I think that's where we are. Isabel Van Bruggen thinks that's where we are over at the Daily Beast. I guess we should just read the the latest, if this is in fact the latest. Well, the Daily Beast, of course, always having fun with everything that they do, including reporting on swastikas in our armed forces. Not only do we get that, but you know how they I don't know, they attach little goofy labels, graphic labels to their story. I don't know I wonder what they call them internally, because they're not, designations of different verticals where the sports or, entertainment or anything like that, but they just put them there for no reason, I guess, except to give you a chuckle about swastika reporting. It just says Achtung on here. So, I mean, okay. The military service, that would be the Coast Guard that they're talking about, had drafted a policy that labeled the Nazi insignia potentially divisive. By the way, I don't think I've heard anything else from any of the other branches. Space Force, I guess, has the old school. Leave it to Space Force to be old school. The old school swastika policy, I assume. No one can hear you're a Nazi in space, so I guess it's probably okay. Well, I don't know what to tell you, but the U.S. Coast Guard has reversed course on its controversial move to reclassify the Nazi-era swastika insignia and nooses as potentially divisive following widespread backlash. I mean, that's really all you need to know, I think, about the story. But in addition, it's all I can read to you because they are, of course, paywalled. Well, if I put it in Instapaper, I suppose we could try and figure it out. But I don't know. That's about all the news that I need to know about swastika designation in our armed forces. That yesterday they were foolish enough to try to even think they could get away with reclassifying swastikas as not a hate symbol. And today they realize that's pretty dumb. So there you go. Had they been the Navy and out to sea, they wouldn't have heard all the backlash. But since they were just guarding the coasts and they came back at the end, just guarding the coast, it's just nothing important. They came back in, I guess, to shore and heard that everybody was mad about it. I don't know. I suppose you could get word out there, nonetheless, through extremely low frequency radio contact. But also, I don't know what else they use in the Navy. But you know who does know? As a matter of fact, this is not a bad idea. Maybe I ought to do this. This would be a great way to start the show. But I feel like I need to warm up and get a couple of topics under our belt here first. But our good friend Darwin has sent us an entry, sent it earlier in the week. But Friday is a good day. Tuesday is a good day to play those things. But was I ready for it Tuesday? I was not. He was, but I wasn't. And I prepared it and boosted the signal a little bit and got it ready to play. An article from, of course, was it the Military Times that you were reading to us? Or from military.com. But I mean, is that what they call it, the Military Times? I can't even remember whether that's the name of the paper. I mean, I remember Stars and Stripes. That's easy enough to remember. But sometimes I'm confused as between the online presence and the physical presence of some of these papers. But anyway, military.com is what we'll go with because that's the way they designate themselves. And he's got a piece on the fake name change from the Department of Defense to the Department of War. And you know what? What the hell? Might as well start it now. This way we know we're not going to run into any problems with the brakes. And I don't know, maybe I'll take a little nap while this thing runs. But this is interesting. No, because I can take a nap. I already heard it. But you shouldn't take a nap on it because it's important and interesting. And thank you, Darwin, for sending it along. What's in a name? DOD versus DOW. Are they actually calling it, do they say DOW as shorthand? And why it matters more than you think, which is my favorite kind of headline, as you know. All right. Well, it doesn't matter more than we think. We think, you know what? You and I, we all think probably more than these guys do about just about anything, except for this topic in which they're the experts and you're not. So listen up. Thanks, Darwin, for sending this along.
Hello there, Kagro. Hello, KITM family. It's your boy Darwin Darko reporting again, putting my former military hat on, reading from military.com. This article written by Douglas Lindsay on the 14th of November, and it starts, what's in a name? DOD versus DOW, and why it matters more than you think. When workers at the Pentagon quietly removed Department of Defense plaques and replaced them with new bronze signs reading Department of War, the reaction was immediate. Photos of Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth installing a 60-pound Department of War plaque spread across social media within hours. Supporters praised the symbolism. Critics argued it sent the wrong signal to allies and adversaries. But behind the headlines, the change raises a deeper question. How much power does a name really have? And when it comes to America's most important military institution, does renaming the Department of Defense actually matter? Headline: Why the Pentagon's name change is back in the spotlight. President Trump's September executive order directed the Pentagon to revert to its historic name, though Congress would still need to update the title in federal law. Soon after, Pentagon workers took down the old DoD signs and installed Department of War plaques at two major entrances. Hegseth said the brand restores a clarity of purpose tied to winning wars. But the change isn't just semantic. According to congressional staff and independent analysis, a full rebrand from IT systems to global basing signage could cost up to $2 billion. For comparison, renaming Army and Air Force bases that previously honored Confederate officers cost $62 million across 9 installations. Naming Commission final report give us those numbers. If renaming 9 bases cost $62 million, imagine renaming an entire global defense enterprise. The Pentagon hasn't released its own cost figure yet, but experts agree the price tag will not be small. Next subheadline: The psychology behind a name change. If this debate sounds symbolic, it is, but symbols can shape how institutions think and act. Psychologists call this priming, the idea that language triggers mental models long before people make decisions. A name is a frame. It signals who you are and what you do. Defense suggests protection, stability, deterrence, and partnership. War suggests offense, aggression, kinetic force, confrontation. This is what linguist George Lakoff calls linguistic framing. Words activate metaphors. Metaphors activate emotions, and emotions influence behavior. For an organization as large as the Pentagon, a name shapes strategic identity. The War Department's name changed to the Department of Defense in 1949 because the U.S. was entering a world defined by alliances, nuclear deterrence, and global stability, not constant open conflict. That shift was strategic. Reverting to war sends a different message about America's role today. Next section. Could the name change influence U.S. military behavior? Names don't issue orders. They don't mobilize troops or authorize funding. But names can influence how leaders interpret threats and justify actions. They shape public opinion, political rhetoric, and internal culture. A Department of War could subtly frame global competition in more confrontational terms. Studies in cognitive psychology and strategic communication show that lexical choices influence risk perception. Words like war, fight, and enemy create sharper mental boundaries than words like defense, security, or stability. It doesn't mean the U.S. becomes more aggressive just because of a sign change, but it does shift the psychological baseline, and in Washington, baselines matter. What it could cost to rename the department. Renaming the Pentagon is not like swapping out a building placard. The department's name is embedded in thousands of systems and agreements, including IT networks, cybersecurity certifications, digital forms, procurement language, acquisition regulations, diplomatic agreements and NATO standardization documents, global basing signage at 4,800 facilities, military education materials and doctrine, public-facing websites, recruitment platforms, and branding. Congressional aides estimate the global rebrand would cost $2 billion when all indirect changes are included, and it won't happen overnight. Every partner nation with a U.S. defense agreement, from Japan to Poland to the Philippines, would have to update documentation referring to the Department of Defense that's decades of treaties, MOUs, operational frameworks. The 2021 to 2023 base renamings provide a clear example of this scope. 9 bases, $62 million, and months of planning. The Pentagon is exponentially larger than that. Next section here, military culture, why language is never just language. The U.S. military is built on symbols, patches, models, call signs, unit heritage. Language reinforces identity. A title like commander versus manager carries weight. Marines aren't employees, they are Marines. The Pentagon's name is part of that cultural story. Changing it reshapes not just outward messaging, but internal mindset. How leaders talk about missions, how troops imagine the purpose of the service, how policymakers explain national security, how the public interprets America's posture in the world. A name becomes part of the cultural narrative, and culture, more than any other budget, drives how institutions think. They wrap up here. Supporters say it restores clarity. Critics say the signage is aggression. Supporters of Department of War argue it is more honest about the military's purpose. It reinforces a mindset focused on winning, not managing. Rivals like China, Russia, Iran will better understand the U.S. resolve. Critics, on the other hand, say that it may signal unnecessary aggression to allies. It oversimplifies the military's modern mission set. We're talking about cybersecurity, space operations, humanitarian relief. Also, critics say that it risks escalating tensions by emphasizing conflict over deterrence. Inside the Pentagon, some leaders have raised concerns that the new name could complicate basing rights and diplomatic agreements where defense carries a softer connotation than war. The debate is not just semantic, it's strategic. The public's reaction reveals a generational divide. And I know how much you love polls, David, so this one's for you. A new Reuters Ipsos poll tracking public attitudes towards recent national security shifts found broad disagreement over the administration's more aggressive security posture. That's Reuters polling. While the poll did not directly ask about the name change, the results show Americans are sharply split on how forcefully the military should act. Among service members and veterans, reactions are mixed as well. Some welcome the return to a, quote, fighting spirit. Others say the change does not reflect the realities of modern operations. The split mirrors a broader generational divide in how Americans define military power, through overwhelming force or through alliance management and deterrence. A look back. The last time America changed the name, the U.S. created the Department of War in 1789 to oversee the Army. After World War II, the Truman administration reorganized the national security apparatus into the National Military Establishment and in 1949 renamed it the Department of Defense. That 1949 change was intentional. It symbolized a shift from winning wars to preventing them. The current push to restore war may symbolize the reverse. So does it matter? This is where the debate becomes bigger than politics. Names matter because they tell a story. They signal how a nation sees itself. They influence how institutions behave. They shape how allies interpret American actions. They affect how adversaries calculate risk. The Department of Defense suggests a commitment to stability. A Department of War suggests readiness for direct confrontation. Let's keep an eye out on Venezuela with that said. Neither is inherently good nor bad. Both reflect strategic worldviews, but the difference is not small, not at this moment in history. The remaining debate forces the country to ask itself, and they land the plane here by asking, what story should America tell about its military today? Is it the story of a nation defending the system it built, or the story of a nation preparing for the conflicts it expects? At a time of global volatility, from the Western Pacific to the Middle East, and I would add South America, to cyberspace, names shape perceptions long before strategy does. In national security, perception is power. And sometimes a name is not just a name, it's a declaration. So that's the article. You can find it at military.com. Thanks for listening. This is Darwin Darko. Back to you, David.
Thanks, Darwin. I appreciate your contribution for a number of reasons, not the least of which is it gave me a chance to actually get some salt water gargle and a little bit of tea to try and get rid of the frog in the throat this morning. But much appreciated and a great topic and a great entree into pretty much everything else. So, we could have started in any direction, but that's as good as any. And great warning toward the end there, which is to keep an eye on our activities around and I guess eventually possibly in Venezuela, given all of this. I think we got a warning sign just yesterday, an economic warning. Was it Scott Bessent who was on TV and I guess hinting that, bizarrely enough, that oil prices could be coming down drastically in the near future. Why? First of all, because the administration very much needs oil prices to come down drastically in the future because the president, the idiot, has been out there telling everybody that there's $2 gas all over the country and it'll even be cheaper soon. And it's not even close to that. I don't know whether you've got anything close to that near you, but, it's about $3 a gallon here, and that's if you're doing well. But no sign of $2 a gallon gas. But, he's, I guess he just wants to see if anybody can make reality match his rhetoric. But I guess the thinking from Bessent was equally magical, which is, we will invade and or find ourselves openly at war with Venezuela, which has, do I remember this correctly, that somebody said they now have the world's largest proven oil reserves. I don't really realize. I didn't realize how they moved up in that status or what that means. That sort of sounds qualified, like, well, it's they're reserves, but they can't get to any of them. But they're there. So maybe they will later. I don't know. I'm not certain what that means in the oil business, but it's meant to mean like there's an awful lot of potential for, more fossil fuels to be pumped out of Venezuela, which, of course, in the normal course of things, they could use to generate an awful lot of income and make themselves one of the richest nations in the world and raise their standard of living drastically. Or the United States could come and steal all of that and somehow still not really improve the quality of life of Americans or Venezuelans. But, we're pretty adept at that. Anyway, the pronouncement was, well, oil prices will be cheaper because, hint, hint, the subtext was, we're going to go to war with the guys who have the oil, which means we'll steal it, which means we'll, of course, give it away free to Americans. No, of course not. And secondly, typically, even during a war for oil, oil prices go up. Why? Because look how hard we have to work in order to get this oil to you. That's very expensive, and people are dying, and they cost money. And we're going to need to pass that expense on to you. If it ever lowers the cost of oil, which it doesn't, because why would oil companies ever lower their prices generally? I mean, they fluctuate from time to time based on the market. That's true. They would prefer high oil prices, but they don't go around looking to pass on savings to the consumer generally in the long term. They just play along with market fluctuations. And a war with the country that has the largest proven reserves of oil, I think, would tend to damage the supply of oil. After all, they're pumping it out as fast as they're able, I assume, in an attempt to capitalize on that. And then if you blow all of them up, well, that's usually less oil. Plus, of course, you leak oil on the way to and from the missions to blow up their oil. But anyway, I don't think that that's very likely short term to lower the price of gas. But hey, I would say your opinion may differ, but it will instead rely on your mileage may vary. But it might not, because you might be driving an electric vehicle. Anyway, in relation to that, I guess, a different angle on the Venezuela story, this one reported by the UK's Independent. Why? Because it has to do with the internal corruption of the United States federal government, and we don't report on that stuff here in America. At least not first, until we can find out whether or not the reporter who reports it overseas got chopped up by, Mr. Bonesaw or any of his friends. Maybe that was one of the gifts that they made to Donald Trump along the way. Anyway, this news is that a top military lawyer, you'll never believe it, has raised concerns, and in fact had raised concerns in writing about Trump's drug boat, and that's quote unquote drug boat in the headline, strikes, and was promptly ignored. And then my second favorite headline construction conceit, report. Who said all this? A report did. All right, how did that happen? I don't know. But Mike Bedigan has reported this, but they actually put his name on it. I could say that this is all according to a report of the Independent UK, but all right, we'll read you the thing. The senior judge advocate general that was involved in this has reportedly raised concerns that the airstrikes against the alleged, quote, narco-terrorists could amount to extrajudicial killings. They do. But the point was that it could potentially, officially do so. And this should be read alongside the news from the other day that there was, in fact, inside the DOJ, a memo from career prosecutors to the U.S. attorney and presumably the attorney general as well. Hey, we recommend against indicting James Comey and bringing a case. We don't think it's strong enough. It's not going to hold up, and it's going to end up embarrassing you. A declination of charges. We declined to bring charges. We would recommend that you decline. And they were overruled, and they went and did it anyway. And they're making a fool of themselves, making many fools of themselves. But same thing now happening inside the military. Career employees whose job it is to opine on these things are opining, and they're being ignored. It's not surprising. It's just, still nonetheless a bit shocking. A top military lawyer raised concerns over the legality of the Trump administration's strikes on, quote, drug boats in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, but was ignored by higher-ups, according to a new report. That is their prerogative to ignore it. It's just interesting. The senior judge advocate general, or JAG, as we call him here, or on TV, posted at U.S. Southern Command in Miami, reportedly raised concerns that the strikes against the alleged, quote, narco-terrorists could amount to extrajudicial killings and legally expose American service members involved in such operations. That's why there's now a OLC memo that says, nuh-uh, and not much more. And, of course, it suggests that that's perhaps why the commander of Southern Command, Southcom, quietly / very loudly resigned. Quietly, he's not saying anything now, but we say loudly resigned by letting everybody know, that's it, I'm out of here, but not telling you why. His concerns were raised in August, the sources said. This is the JAG, not the commander, prior to the first strikes, which occurred against small boats in the Caribbean on September 2nd. The strikes have since expanded with assaults on the Eastern Pacific, killing at least 80 people in all in 20 strikes on alleged smuggling craft. The JAG was identified as, we got a name. Should we give it out? I think our audience will treat them well. Marine Colonel Paul Meagher. And that identification coming from several sources who spoke to NBC. Operations of a similar nature typically move forward based on the opinion of the JAG, though they can be overruled by higher administration officials. And guess what? In this case, they were. Meagher's reported concerns align with those of human rights groups and experts in international law who have also warned that the strikes are illegal, with the governments of both Venezuela and Colombia accusing the Trump administration of engaging in extrajudicial murder. Oh, that's bad.
Hi, I'm Scott Anderson, the guy that writes the daily summary for this show, Kagro in the Morning. Thank you to everyone that supports this show. Many of you send donations through PayPal, Patreon, Square Cash, Radio Public, and so on. Some of you write your own essays and send them in, or read articles with your own commentary. We appreciate it. Now, some of you are listening to this and thinking, I'd like to help, but isn't there something I could do that wouldn't require money or effort? Why, yes, there is. You can just like us. On Daily Kos, they call it the recommend button. YouTube has a thumbs up. There are hearts and likes and love buttons. Tap our love button. Tap our love button every day. Share our shows and summaries on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and iTunes, Stitcher and Amazon. Most of these places allow you to write a review, so a sentence or two would be great. Recommend us to social media, or tell your friends to listen to the show. You aren't just helping us, you're helping them find their new favorite thing to listen to. You could change the world. So thank you in advance from me and everybody else in the world.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio, and for some reason my computer is thinking about whether or not it wants to allow the continuation of the reading of the UK Independent story on what happened inside the JAG Corps, where Marine Colonel Paul Meagher, apparently, like most normal and right-thinking people, viewed these attacks as at least potentially extrajudicial murder, and thought that perhaps it should be set down on paper, and the signal should be, we should think about this a little bit more before we start doing this thing. You remember, he issued this before September 2nd. In other words, they told him, here's what we're thinking of doing. What do you think about the legality of it? And he said, I don't really need all that long to think it over. It's wrong. You should not do it. And then they went ahead and did it. So what's been the shakeout from that? Well, let's scroll down and get to the rest of the reporting. Part of the pondering that the computer was doing, I guess, included whether or not to display the rest of the article, because it's taking its sweet time making that decision. Here we are. There's at least a little bit more of it here. Other internal, I was going to say international, but no, it's internal fallout from the strikes has included the upcoming resignation of the head of Southern Command, Admiral Alvin Halsey. What's the, I guess now I have to roll back and look at the date of this thing. But of course, goodness gracious, this machine is like erasing. They're erasing this thing in real time. I don't know why there were parts of this thing were already displayed and now they're gone. It says November 20th. So maybe he handed in his resignation, made the announcement, but it was going to be effective shortly and has not yet become effective. That's my best guess. I might have to go into Instapaper and see this piece displayed that way, because this page is just not wanting to load. Although I don't know now, the Instapaper version doesn't want to load either. I don't know what's going on. It's just taking its sweet time. All right, where were we with this? All right, so the upcoming resignation of the head of Southern Command, Admiral Alvin Halsey, who announced in October that he would be stepping down this month, that's November, after less than a year on the job, a role that typically lasts about 3. In a statement shared with The Independent, Chief Pentagon spokesman Sean Parnell denied claims that the operations were illegal. That's what he's going to do. The War Department, there it is, categorically denies that any Pentagon lawyers, including Southcom lawyers, with knowledge of these operations have raised concerns to any attorneys in the chain of command regarding the legality of the strikes conducted thus far, because they are aware we are on firm legal ground, Parnell said. How does he defend that? Categorically denies that any Pentagon lawyers, including Southcom lawyers, and that's what this guy is, with knowledge of the operations have raised concerns to any attorneys in the chain of command. So, I mean, sometimes, it's very weird how they sometimes will try and parse a statement such that it sounds categorical, but in fact, if you look at it, it only denies a certain part of things. And I wonder why they don't just go right ahead and just lie outright about everything broadly. And they very frequently, I mean, they show no, compunction about lying generally. So I don't know why they don't just do that. But I guess if you parse this thing, I don't know where Colonel Mager's report went to. If it went to the Southcom commander and he's not in the JAG Corps, then I guess you could say, well, technically, no Pentagon lawyer, including Southcom lawyers, with knowledge of the operations, has raised concerns to any attorneys in the chain of command regarding the legality of the strikes conducted thus far, and then just threw in there, because they are aware we're on firm legal ground. But at a minimum, it gives the wrong impression, to say the very least. I'm sure that his memo was meant to be viewed by other lawyers as well, but if it went directly to the Southcom commander, I guess you could technically say that's true, although I don't know what it buys you. Anyway, naturally, it is also overstating the case to say that the reason it didn't go to any other lawyers is because even if somebody did think it was illegal, they knew that they were wrong. So that's why they didn't tell any other lawyers about it. I guess that's the hair-splitting answer as to or what Parnell would tell an investigative committee about why he didn't lie, even though it looks like he did. Our current operations in the Caribbean are lawful under both U.S. and international law, with all actions in complete compliance with the law of armed conflict. I don't think that's the case, but, he's paid to say that he thinks that he does. I guess also, by the way, you could use as an excuse if you were parsing things. Well, I said that no lawyers in the Pentagon or Southcom told any other lawyers that they thought this and had knowledge of the situation. We actually think he doesn't have knowledge of the situation. We define knowledge as being on our side. If you had knowledge, you wouldn't be on the other side. It's just simple as that. I mean, I guess there's that dodge. The Independent has also contacted the White House for comment on the reports. It comes shortly after a secret memo from the Justice Department greenlighting the strikes revealed that the justification for such force was based entirely on assertions made by the president. Those good old-fashioned presidential determinations. Oh, and somewhere in here I have a story parked. You know what it is? It probably was in the stories that we opted not to read yesterday because Greg, in his discussion, had so thoroughly covered the situation in the Comey case where the prosecutors in the Eastern District of Virginia screwed everything up with the grand jury. but somewhere in there was word, I think was from the judge in that case, although there might also have been the similar, it might have been in something in front of Judge Boasberg. I'll have to search around. But just because I used one of our favorite catchphrase buzzwords or legal buzzwords here was about the presumption of regularity. I think we've prepared you well for that. And when you see that happening now, you're like, ooh, like the Wilhelm scream of judicial terminology. All right. Well, here we were talking about a slightly different concept. The Department of Justice memo greenlighting the strikes was based entirely on assertions made by the president. And that's shaky ground usually, even worse with President Brain MRI, who thinks, again, windmills, wind turbines cause ear cancer in whales, et cetera, and you name it. A presidential determination by a guy like that, it's got to be worth less. I mean, just really. I know there's deference supposed to be given, but why? All right, to wrap up here, according to the memo seen by the New York Times, such strikes are deemed appropriate because of the idea that the U.S. and its allies are at present legally in a state of armed conflict with drug cartels, assertions that the White House has repeatedly made. As a result, the argument goes, the killing of those suspected of running the drugs falls within the lawful purview of Trump's wartime powers. Trump's argument that the U.S. is engaged in an armed conflict with the drug cartels relies on the same legal authority used by George W. Bush's administration when it declared its war on terror after the al-Qaeda attacks of September 11th, 2001. You might not have necessarily gone there to say that, but if you're a regular listener to the show, you would, because I've been saying it all along. This traces its origins back to post 9/11 Patriot Act and AUMF tomfoolery, let's say, where the president was able to just say, well, so I'm allowed to do this as long as there's a presidential declaration saying this and the other condition have been met. Well, then I declare those conditions to have been met. It's just, it was no less dangerous when Trump did it, no less baseless and foolish. But I guess Trump has taken it to such an extreme that we now think of that unfortunately now normalizes what George W. Bush did during his administration. But it shouldn't. And the guy who drove him to it is just recently died. So that's kind of interest too. All right. That makes me think about other things I wanted to share with you, which are parked around. I wonder, I'm gonna scroll a little bit through Instant Paper and see whether I can't recall exactly where the concern about the presumption of regularity landed in the several articles that I ended up archiving rather than reading through yesterday. But I don't know. We may encounter it in some of the other courtroom type coverage or legal topic coverage. But there's an awful lot going on in the Justice Department, and some things I wanted to share with you. What I'll do, if we happen across it in some of the other stories that we read, just as well. But maybe a thing to do here, a good Friday activity, would be to read through some of the stories that I pointed you to the other day in the stem winder in the New York Times Magazine from last weekend about the unraveling of the Justice Department. 60 attorneys that they spoke to describe a year of chaos and suspicion. Emily Bazelon, I hope that's the right pronunciation, and Rachel Poser put this together, along with the photos feature prominently in the profile. So they note up top that the photographs are by Stephen Voss, and they're wonderful photographs. And again, it's one of those graphically presented things that have photos of the attorneys they're speaking to and pull quotes from them. And it's interesting. I know we'll end up reading those quotes later in the broader profile, but, well, we may not get to all the profiles. and it will become slightly repetitive, but they're short enough quotes. The first one up here, up at the top, Mike Romano, former prosecutor in the public integrity section, quoted as saying, "If we're indicting people because the president hates them," I think we read this one, "that's counter to the whole point of doing my job," right? And Dina Robinson, former lawyer in the Civil Rights Division, saying, "Our job wasn't to engage in fact-finding investigations. Our job was to find the facts that would fit the narrative." That's got to be frustrating. Joseph Terrell, the former director of the Departmental Ethics Office, they didn't want the Ethics Office calling them up and telling them what to do, right? This is all setting the table for the larger report, which begins this way. President Trump's second term has brought a period of turmoil and controversy unlike any in the history of the Justice Department. Trump and his appointees have blasted through the walls designed to protect the nation's most powerful law enforcement agency from political influence. They have directed the course of criminal investigations, openly flouted ethics rules, and caused a breakdown of institutional culture. To date, more than 200 career attorneys have been fired, and thousands more have resigned. The Justice Department says many of them have been replaced, they add parenthetically. Now, by the way, just one, I'm sure there'll be many notes along the way, but there was news just the other day that we did not cover about another member of Congress indicted recently, and we didn't discuss it at all, but one of the problems with it, this is a sort of standard type of indictment, that is to say, you see it from time to time among members of Congress, and you say, well, hard to believe that somebody would be that foolish to do something like that, but I guess it happens from time to time. A Democrat that I'm not familiar with, Representative Sheila Cherfilus-McCormick, indicted on federal fraud charges on Wednesday. She's from Florida. This article is Politico's entry about how she will step aside from her leadership position on the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee while the matter is ongoing. Again, also fairly standard practice when a member comes under investigation. And it seems like kind of, I don't know much about the case, honestly. I only know this. It's really upsetting that you have to give serious consideration to the possibility that she's entirely innocent of these charges and that they made them up and they are invented out of whole cloth to take down a Democrat. The only issue with believing that in the first instance is I don't know who Sheila Cherfilus-McCormick is, and that probably means Donald Trump doesn't either, though she's from Florida, so it's entirely possible that some Pervolago member complained to him about her, about doing something. Yeah, but it really could be as simple as that. A Pervolago member got angry. They stepped in on something, a development project or something like that they wanted to go forward. And can't you do something about this crazy woman who's in Congress? Why, sure we can. We'll put her under federal fraud investigation. It really could be just that. And it's difficult. That's part of the presumption of regularity. You can no longer assume that indictments of members of Congress, which are very important cases, coming down from the DOJ are serious and have actually been researched and investigated properly and are being properly founded when indictments come down. But, we didn't hear anything in the brief passerby view that I've taken of the story that there was any difficulty in getting a grand jury to indict her. So I guess there's at least that regularity has gone on. And the name of the U.S. attorney that has charged them is not all over the newspaper along with it. Although now I'm thinking, oh, yes, it is. Is it, what's his name? The new guy that we called out the other day because he was, again, a hand-picked successor chosen, as many of the U.S. attorneys are, by the president, but who was bringing these important cases that Florida was trumping up in Eileen Cannon's courtroom. Wasn't it it had a name like a Jason or something, or Quinones, wasn't it? There was I can't remember anymore, but probably, let's see. I wonder what other news stories there are about it that we can quickly skim and see if it's being handled by a line prosecutor or whether the new a U.S. attorney down there who's for Southern District of Florida is taking it. I don't know what district this is happening in, only that she's from Florida. All right. Well, that may be more of a distraction than we really want at the moment from this New York Times magazine piece. Let's go back to that because it's a much broader issue. What was it like inside this institution, they ask, as Trump's officials took control? It's not an easy question to answer. Justice Department norms dictate that career attorneys, who are generally nonpartisan public servants, rarely speak to the press, and the Trump administration's attempt to crack down on leaks have made all federal employees fearful of sharing information. But the exodus of lawyers has created an opportunity to understand what's happening within the agency. We interviewed more than 60 attorneys who recently resigned or were fired from the Justice Department. Much of what they told us is reported here for the first time. Beginning with Trump's first day in office, the lawyers narrated the events that most alarmed them over the next 10 months. They described being asked to drop cases for political reasons, to find evidence for flimsy investigations, and to take positions in court that they thought had no legitimate basis. They also talked about the work that they and their colleagues were told to abandon, investigations of terrorist plots, corruption, and white-collar fraud. Some spoke on condition of anonymity because they feared retaliation against them or their new employers. We corroborated their accounts with multiple sources, interviewing their colleagues to confirm the details of what they described and reviewing court documents and contemporaneous notes. We also sent a list of questions to the Justice Department and the White House. And of course they said, this story is a collection or useless collection of recycled, debunked hearsay from disgruntled former employees. That was a DOJ spokeswoman responding to an email, targeting the department's political leadership while ignoring the questionable conduct of former attorneys who do not have the American people's best interests at heart, shows exactly how biased this story is and further illustrates why Americans are turning away from biased, outdated legacy media platforms. That's not an answer. It's a rant about news. And if you know anything about these people who are career employees in the DOJ, have worked under, once again, presidents of both parties, the description could not be less accurate. The attorneys who spoke to us for this project, many of whom have spent decades in government services, disagree. Yeah, well, okay. Not hard to figure out. Oh, by the way, here, so there's a section here in italics, and I don't know, I mean, is this a timeline thing? January 20th. On his first day in office, President Trump made it clear that lawyers loyal to him would lead the Justice Department. One of his personal defense attorneys, Emil Bove, became the temporary number 2. Oh, he's still number 2, believe me. And Trump nominated another of his lawyers, Todd Blanche, to take the position permanently once the Senate confirmed him. Trump also undid one of the largest investigations in the Justice Department's history and that's important to note. I mean, it's not just that it was personally connected to him. It was one of the largest investigations in Justice Department history. The most work ever, by the most people ever, went into this, and he just undid it by pardoning people across the board, or commuting the sentences of nearly 1,600 rioters who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. Never mind what the actual crime was, which was incredible all by itself. The group included more than 200 defendants who were convicted of assaulting law enforcement officers. But there you go, Law and Order Party. So first up here is the interview with Ryan Crosswell from the Public Integrity section, which handles corruption cases, which would normally be a big problem for the Trump administration. So we got to get rid of it. And so first thing he says, when I saw it was Blanche and Bove, I was actually relieved. Okay, it's gross that they were Trump's personal attorneys, but before that, they were federal prosecutors in New York. They've done the job. They know the prosecutor's code. We're the only lawyers whose job is not to get the best results for our client. Our job is to get justice. Sometimes that means losing or walking into court and saying we made a mistake. But then things were 10 times worse than I thought they would be. Next up, comment I guess this is all in the general January 20th time span here. Liz Oyer, who's the pardon attorney, or was the pardon attorney beforehand, and is doing a bang-up job on TikTok and other social media right now, keeping us up to date. We had no knowledge that the January 6th pardons were coming on day one. I mean, I think you should have. Everybody was concerned that our office was being completely sidelined from the review process. Oh, I see. So at least, I mean, what she's saying is inside the pardons office, since they hadn't heard anything, everybody else was just assuming he would just pardon people, but they were people in a position to know whether or not the normal process of pardons had been undertaken because they would have seen the paperwork, and they hadn't seen it. So, for them, the presumption of normality and regularity, they thought it was ridiculous to think that there would be these overbroad and overreaching pardons happening if there was no paperwork happening. But then, had she been listening to the show, she would have known that Trump doesn't do paperwork. And she might have said, I'm sorry, I guess my gut is a better indicator here than the paperwork is as to whether or not there's going to be pardons. Gregory Rosen, chief of the breach and assault unit at the Capitol Siege section, which prosecuted the January 6th rioters, said, when I was alerted to the pardons, a lot of thoughts ran through my head about how absurd this could get. But first, I had to do my job. We had to ask, did we believe the order was lawful and constitutional? Really? I mean, that's good that they start their inquiry there. We really actually have to ask, is this real? Is it a legal and constitutional order to extend clemency to these people? Well, my team and I determined that it was. The president has the right to pardon people and commute their sentences. So then it was a blitzkrieg of hundreds of cases. We stepped to it. But there you go. I think that wraps up really rather neatly how these guys approached the job. It really shouldn't be legal or constitutional, but there's nothing we can point to that says it isn't. We abhor it, but it's ordered by the president and we can't find legal basis for saying no, so let's do the job. But he's out now anyway. I was numb. As career prosecutors, we don't talk about our feelings. We're not partisans. We're public servants just doing the job. Early on, we stayed away from using emotional language about our own reactions. Then Mike Romano, one of the January 6th prosecutors, says, anyone who spent any time working on the January 6th cases saw how violent that day was. I'd spent 4 years living with that day, the things done to people. It's incredibly demoralizing to see something you worked on for 4 years wiped away by a lie. I mean, the idea that prosecution of the rioters was a grave national injustice. We had strong evidence against every person we prosecuted, and I knew that if they're going to wipe all of that away based on a lie, either I'll be fired as retaliation or pretext or asked to do something unethical or both. Until that point, I'd hoped the second Trump term would be similar to the first one, or similar enough for a while. Then the pardons came down, and I knew in light of that, there is no way that I can stay. And I'll just add this note here. When he says I was hoping that it would be like the first Trump administration, these people all, for the most part, I think probably all of them served, at least during part of the Trump administration, if not all the way through it. And, disagreed personally, probably all the way through it. But like they described, they did their jobs. And there was a different approach in the first administration, where if you really, personally disagreed with what you were being asked to the kind of case you were handling, they would hand it to somebody else and say, you could do other things that are a little bit less sharply partisan, and they weren't out to purge the department the way they are this time around. So he makes an interesting point. So now moving on a week into late January, 27th through the 31st, the next phase of things, where it's noted Trump appointed Ed Martin, another longtime ally, as interim U.S. attorney for the District of Columbia. You remember that. Martin had promoted Trump's baseless claims of election fraud in 2020 and then turned to the cause of defending the January 6th rioters. He had never worked as a prosecutor. Martin soon fired 15 attorneys in the Capitol Siege section who prosecuted the January 6th defendants. They joined more than a dozen other prosecutors fired for working under the special counsel, Jack Smith, on the criminal investigations of President Trump. According to the DOJ's new leadership, they could not be trusted to, quote, faithfully implement the president's agenda. Gregory Rosen, again from the Capitol Siege section, says, when 15 employees were fired from the Capitol Siege section, I was the angriest I've ever been. Most of them were younger attorneys. I'd hired them. They came from firms, federal and state government, all over. But some naive part of me thought, maybe this is the new leadership's pound of flesh. I guess there was more to come. A nameless, for the moment, prosecutor from the Capitol Siege section says it was inconceivable to me that they'd fire people for no reason except they'd worked on cases that were now disfavored. People like me, who are career attorneys, work within a structure. We don't have much latitude. To be told that you are being punished for your decisions when you were following guidance created by very talented and very skilled prosecutors above you, which judges blessed for the most part, it's completely bizarre. It flipped the culture of the institution. It's a culture now of fear, and they are losing people all the time, very good people who were the future of the department. Peter Carr, senior communications advisor, says, I have never seen prosecutors targeted simply because the case they brought was something that the current DOJ leadership did not like. How can you take these very difficult and challenging cases involving high-profile individuals with the knowledge that at some point in the future, someone is going to end your career because of it? Now, a couple of other pull quotes here before we get to the next section. Gregory Rosen, once again, now this time featured in the photograph. I laughed when I found out we were demoted, but it was clear to me just how truly vindictive this would get. And before we jump off into break here, we'll set things up with what's happening now. We've moved on to February 5th, where Pam Bondi, another former Trump defense lawyer, was sworn in as Attorney General. She issued a first-day flurry of 14 memos that radically redefined the department's mission. One mandated that government attorneys zealously defend, that's the quote, zealously defend the president's agenda, no longer giving them the latitude to decline to sign a brief or appear in court because of a personal judgment about a case, a long-standing practice of the department. That's how most people got through the first Trump administration. Another pulled back on enforcing the Foreign Agents Registration Act, a watchdog law that requires people to disclose when they're working for international powers. They had just finally succeeded in giving that teeth. They took them away. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. I'm just going to continue on reading all this because this sort of insider perspective, well, it's going to drive Scott nuts because we don't have enough links to fill out a good summary. This is just genuinely good insight into just how crazy things have gotten inside the Department of Justice and why you would be fully justified in looking at the announcement, for instance, that what's her name here, Sheila Cherfilus-McCormick has been indicted on fraud charges. You would be perfectly justified in saying, yeah, but really though, did she do this, or is this are they mad at her for something else and they're making up charges? Before I continue on with this reading, I'll just note for the record that in Maryland, it turns out that the U.S. Attorney's Office there, I guess they'll be fired this weekend, are investigating Bill Pulte and his crew to see whether they in fact violated any standards in targeting investigations in the Federal Housing Finance Agency's files, looking for mortgage cases that they could launch against people who were enemies, deemed to be enemies of the president. They're actually looking into that as, the corruption and unethical practice that it is. And I don't know, how long can that go on? I guess they're looking for a way out too. Fire us so we can finally go make some bank in private practice, I guess. Or they're just thinking, wouldn't it be nice if there was law and order and the truth, justice, and the American way and whatnot still in this country? We could ascribe a higher motivation to it if you want. All right, so we had just said we're setting the stage for now February 5th. Pam Bondi comes in. First thing she does is says your job is to zealously defend the president's agenda, not the Constitution or anything else. And 2, you're not allowed to decline to sign a brief or appear in court because you think the case is a loser or whatever, or unfounded, and so you'll be fired for refusing. That, too, another long-standing practice. Plus, of course, the progress that had been made in giving teeth to the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which was in need of teeth because it would otherwise have had a difficult time pointing out how many people in the first Trump administration were, in fact, acting on behalf of foreign governments for pay. And now that they were able to actually prosecute this crime, it was time for Pam Bondi to knock the newly grown-in teeth down the throat of the Foreign Agents Registration Act and make way for more international super spy grift. So, first comment on that period comes from Katie Chambly-Ryan from the Civil Rights Division, who says, when Bondi's 14 emails started coming in, 14, and they were all 88 words long, by the way, one was crazier than the next. It's hard to explain how shocking that was. In the Biden administration, there were all these checks in place to make sure we weren't acting on our political biases. You know, Merrick Garland did a good job, at least in that, making sure people weren't acting on political biases, or at all, really, but okay. But it was so by the book. It was too slow, to be honest. Now, that seemed farcical. So there you go. If even from inside the department, they're saying, yeah, maybe Merrick Garland wasn't awesome. So take that for what it's worth, right? I mean, there's a lot of pushback on what he could and couldn't have done and whether it was foolish for him to be so careful. Yes, but it was understandable. That was the culture of the department, and that's what makes this stuff so crazy. And I'm hoping that this also helps illustrate how crazy it is that they made the mistake that, you know, Greg and I went over and spent so much time on yesterday. That's so insane that nobody knows what to do about it, because it's like, what do you mean we've been proceeding with pretrial motions in a case where there's been no indictment? How do we even unwind this? All right. An unnamed lawyer from the Federal Programs Branch, which defends legal challenges against government agencies, said of this period, February 5th period, Bondi's memo on zealous advocacy suggested we could be disciplined or fired for pushing back on legal or factual claims that we believed were unsupported. That threw up red flags for me. It was just completely improper. Right. So if the president says we got to sue the windmill companies on behalf of the deaf whales, like you say, that's not something we really ought to put our name on. You're fired then for saying that. That is a red flag. Dina Robinson, one of the previously featured photos from the Civil Rights Division, said some of us referred to them as Pam Bondi's mixtape because they were so random, these emails, and there were so many dropped all at once. One thing that stuck out to me was her insistence that we served at the pleasure of the president and that we were enforcing the president's priorities. We swore an oath to uphold the Constitution. Right. I mean, just basic incompatibility of philosophy. And, of course, just had the president and Bondi's position had just generally been universally understood among practicing attorneys, left, right, center, for hundreds of years as that's the way this works. Now, not that many hundreds of years. We don't have that many to work with. And the modern Department of Justice hasn't been around in its current form for that long, but decades certainly. But even stretching beyond that policy, it was just well understood. You are working in service of the government and the Constitution, those things being considered to be permanent, minus our Civil War, and the president, in the person of the president. This is why you don't, swear loyalty personally to the president. Is just a temporary occupant of the constitutionally mandated office, and you deal with long term. Some other president of a different viewpoint and a different ideological philosophy is going to occupy this office, and will need to have the same latitude with respect to how he approaches the law. We have to guard that and keep that in mind for the long term. But Bondi just said, no, Do what I say, and the president says, and do it now, no matter what the effect is on future presidents. Another unnamed lawyer, this one from the National Security Division, says Bondi signaled the Foreign Agents Registration Act would be enforced only in very limited circumstances after the Justice Department had done a lot over the last decade to give it teeth. At its core, FARA is a transparency statute. So, the most transparent administration in history. First thing they did, step in and get rid of the transparency statute. But it's to let the American public know when foreign actors engage in political activities or try to influence U.S. discourse. If you're concerned about foreign money and influence in politics, it's a bad time to go dark. And it is. Next, the February 10th through 14th period, the notes here say, in a memo, Emile Beauvais, as what kind of Deputy Attorney General? The acting kind. Directed Danielle Sassoon, remember her? I think we mentioned her a couple months back. Then also an acting U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York. You remember those guys, SDNY. Directed Sassoon to dismiss corruption charges against Mayor Eric Adams of New York City. Remember that guy? By the way, he's still mayor of New York City, even though he has lost his re-election bid. And just of note, Zoran Mamdani, who has won the mayoralty and will be sworn in next year, is slated to visit Donald Trump at the White House today. So we'll see whether he gets the Vladimir Zelensky treatment or what, or whether he gets pointed at and called a piggy today, or I don't know. It might be in Trump's interest to just smile and hint that he'll stick a dagger in his back later on rather than actually confront him and yell at him today. We'll see how that goes. Anyway, back to New York, where Danielle Sassoon was directed to dismiss corruption charges against Mayor Adams. Beauvais said he ordered the dismissal in part because the pending prosecution impacted Adams' ability to, quote, support critical ongoing federal efforts, unquote, to enforce immigration laws. Sassoon wrote to Bondi saying she couldn't make a good faith argument to dismiss the charges, asking for a meeting and offering to resign. Bondi didn't even bother to respond. Instead, Beauvais took the unusual step of bringing in the case to another unit, the Public Integrity Section, which is based in Washington and was created after Watergate to oversee enforcement of public corruption laws. This is not entirely nonsensical, but, the crime was committed in New York. You really should have a local prosecutor handling that. So, here's the comments from an unnamed prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office at SDNY. The New York Times reported that Beauvais accepted Danielle's resignation. That's how we all found out. A lot of people were shell-shocked and upset, and also proud, I think. My impression was that people thought the way Danielle handled it was right and admirable. Ryan Croswell from the Public Integrity Section says, Beauvais' memo to Sassoon was such a drastic change from anything we'd ever seen. Mike Romano, January 6th, and Public Integrity. Then Beauvais instructed the acting chief of Public Integrity Section, John Keller, the acting chief, that's right, to dismiss the case. And so they asked Sassoon, she refused, she resigned. They asked the next person in line, the acting chief, to dismiss the case. He refuses, he resigns, effective that day. The whole staff of the Public Integrity Section was called into a meeting, around 25 attorneys plus support staff. John told us what happened. We were stunned. 3 of the 4 deputy chiefs of the Public Integrity Section, and by the way, PIN for support, Public Integrity, PIN, I guess. I don't know whether they say PIN or not. 3 of the 4 deputy chiefs of PIN were there. Parenthetically, the 4th deputy chief was on maternity leave at the time, by the way. I recall them saying that they anticipated being asked to dismiss the case, and if so, they'd resign too. John was pretty matter-of-fact and stoic. You could tell he was affected, but he was trying to be a good leader. Some people cried. Afterward, we went to a bar a couple of blocks from the office and started drinking. This is like 2:30 p.m. I had my 1 beer. I told John how much I appreciated what he'd done. I went home, and after that, the deputies were called into a meeting and asked to dismiss the case, and they resigned. And as I recall, the story was, I think they all resigned, and then somebody else who was like, I'm near retirement age anyway, I'll take the rap, I'll sign the papers, and you can all resign without touching it. But anyway, we'll see whether that's described here. Next up, Ryan Crosswell again. On the morning of Friday, February 14th, hey, Valentine's Day, we got an email for a video call with Beauvais at 9:45. It was intense. The camera made clicking noises as it zoomed in on Beauvais at the end of a long table. It was surreal. We were watching one another's reactions on screen. Beauvais' spiel was short. He directed us to sign the motion to dismiss the Adams charges. They could have done it themselves, but I believe they wanted our imprimatur. We all huddled in a conference room and tried to figure out what to do. We had an hour. There were 3 options. 1, someone signs. 2, we all resign. 3, we call their bluff, don't do anything, and see if they fire us. I recommended option 3. I'm still thinking we have civil service protections. But someone said, if you don't sign, they could say you're insubordinate, and that could affect your security clearance, which could affect getting hired for other jobs. I backed off. Then the comments from Romano, who was identified earlier. So they're saving space by not reminding us who they all are, but I think the comments are the more important part. I thought 100% he'd fire everyone because no one would sign. Then one of the lawyers in the section agreed to file the motion to dismiss. I didn't know him super well. He was older, on the verge of retirement. People saw it as protecting the rest of us, not trying to advance himself. Crosswell adds, to my mind, he did something pretty heroic. Then there was a day-long negotiation over how the motion would be worded. It was important to us to be clear we were effectively put at gunpoint. Before, I said, I don't want to leave because I don't want a hack to replace me. But I started writing my resignation letter. I'm a Marine officer. Aside from how wrong it was to drop the case for political reasons, I felt so mad that our deputies had lost their jobs for protecting us. And then from Katie Chambly-Ryan in the Civil Rights Division, what happened to Penn was an alarm blasting everywhere. That's when I was like, they're just going to break every rule. They don't care. That's when private meetings started among staff to talk about whether you have more legal protections if you resign or if you're fired. Next up, February 11th through 18th, when Trump signed an executive order initiating mass cuts to the federal workforce at the direction of the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, as we call it here, the effort led by Elon Musk to slash federal spending. The order called for large-scale payoffs and directed the heads of federal agencies to fill positions with DOGE approval. Defending the order in court, the government denied that the president had given DOGE authority over personnel actions. Judge Tanya S. Chutkan, who ultimately ruled in favor of the government, suggested this statement could be false. But she ruled for them anyway. In the end, she reminded the Justice Department lawyers of their duty to make truthful representations to the court and issued a warning to them by citing Rule 11 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, which allows lawyers to be disciplined for filings that aren't based on sound facts. And now a second unnamed lawyer from the Federal Programs Branch speaks about this. When Judge Chutkan's order came down, that was brutal. Our bar licenses would be on the line if someone associated with DOGE lied about things we had to represent in court. One of the lawyers in the case said he emailed the political leadership about what the judge said about possible sanctions, and they said, NBD, no big deal. I realized that the line attorneys would just be pawns. If we got sacrificed on the way to taking these cases to the Supreme Court, that would just be how it was. Out of 110 lawyers who were in my branch in January, more than 75 have left. The Justice Department, it's parenthetically, the Justice Department said the point of the NBD email was to assure the team that they had done nothing wrong and that about half of the 75 lawyers who left have been replaced. Next, February 18th, the Justice Department asks a court to freeze a legal challenge to the Environmental Protection Agency's decision during the Biden administration to tighten one of its most important air quality standards, the limit on soot. The EPA found in 2021 that the new standard would save thousands of lives and that the health benefits would outweigh the costs of compliance. Make America healthy again. The Trump administration put the litigation on hold in preparation for rolling back the regulation. Sarah Buckley, the Environment and Natural Resources Division attorney, says, "We made blanket requests to courts to put cases on hold where we were defending EPA rules. The soot case was a real gut punch to me. Soot pollution is a major public health problem. The rule we were defending would reduce the number of people getting sick and dying from pollution-caused diseases by a lot. We just had oral argument in December. I thought we were going to win. It felt like victory was being snatched away." Then next up, February 28th, when Ed Martin, the interim U.S. Attorney for Washington, demoted 7 senior supervisors and leaders in the office. It was the latest step in the purge of career attorneys involved in prosecuting the January 6th rioters, as well as 2 Trump allies, Steve Bannon and Peter Navarro. The administration had already removed at least a dozen senior leaders from their positions across the Justice Department, giving some the choice to join the Sanctuary Cities Enforcement Working Group, which was newly formed, to target jurisdictions that refuse to cooperate with federal authorities on immigration enforcement. So first, we hear from Tova Calderon, Principal Deputy Chief at the Appellate Section in the Civil Rights Division. Oh, I know a little about that division. They assigned me and my chief to this new working group and then essentially didn't give us anything to do. Most of us had no experience in immigration law. They took the most experienced, talented people out of their positions, and it had an immediate effect. They were able to change the work of our offices more easily without us there. Gregory Rosen from the Capitol Siege section said, "I laughed when I found out we were demoted." This is the one we read earlier. "But it was clear to me just how truly vindictive this would all get. All of us had collectively had over 100 years of prosecutorial experience. The brain drain was beginning. Maybe the Justice Department survives, but loses all the experts. I'd been promised the position of Deputy of Narcotics and Violent Crime in D.C. Now, by the way, that's for prosecuting that stuff. In the new administration, they might actually just have a deputy for narcotics and violent crime, but this wasn't the case then. But instead, I was demoted to the Early Case Assessment section to review arrest warrants, among other things. While the job is important because this is where we initiate criminal charges, I assumed Martin viewed it as entry-level work and was punishing us." Next, another couple of pull quotes. Ijaz Baluch. Baluch, I suppose, is Baluch. One colleague said, "I have to feed something to the wolves." Okay, let's see what this is about. March 5th now, Trump-appointed leaders in the Civil Rights Division begin directing career attorneys to investigate the University of California system for anti-Semitism and employment discrimination. These investigations were overseen by Leo Terrell, a former Democrat turned Fox News commentator selected by the president to head his multi-agency task force on anti-Semitism. They marked a new stage in the escalating attack on college campuses by the administration, which had already canceled billions of dollars in federal grants and contracts and opened investigations into 60 universities for what it described as a failure to protect Jewish students. Well, the Civil Rights Division attorney Ijaz, E-J-A-Z, Baluch, B-A-L-U-C-H, says the way we did investigations drastically changed. Normally, line attorneys investigate cases and follow the facts and law on a nonpartisan basis. If we discovered a law was violated, we recommended a lawsuit to the leadership of the division. It was bottom up. That process turned upside down. It was now outcome-driven. The prime example I saw was the investigation into the UC school system about allegations of anti-Semitism on campus. In March, Andrea Lucas, who Trump appointed to be, acting chair of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, filed what's called a commissioner's charge, which is essentially a complaint of employment discrimination. It was my section's job to investigate it. And we were told, you have 30 days to do an investigation. and give us a justification memo, which is what we write after we conclude there is a legal violation. So, ahead of time, they're like, well, you're going to write one. You got 30 days to do it. Multiple teams of attorneys went to Berkeley, UCLA, UC Davis, UC San Francisco. Mostly they didn't find sufficient evidence to bring suit. The teams were so scared that in real time, every day, they were summarizing and reporting up to office management, back to Michael Gates, the Deputy Assistant Attorney General, to create a paper trail for how they were not finding evidence. Julia Quinn, Civil Rights Division, said Leo Terrell, who ran the Anti-Semitism Task Force, sells merch. That could be a problem all by itself. And one of the very few people in our office who stayed behind, who got in with the administration, bought a hat. One of his Leo 2.0 hats. He had it in the background of a Zoom. That's just plain weird. But then again, the director of the FBI has merch too. Ijaz Balak again now speaking. The only school that became clear where there might be a violation was UCLA. One colleague said, we have to feed something to the wolves. That's what this is about. The team concluded that the complaint process at the school was broken. Some professors we interviewed really did suffer on campus. They were harassed by groups of students. But the DOJ demand letter to UCLA asking for $1 billion in damages. We thought, $1 billion? Really? They are making that up out of thin air. There is no way the damages we found added up to anything like that amount. Now moving up a little bit to March 6th. At this point, Trump issued the second in a series of executive orders punishing elite law firms that had performed legal work for prominent Democrats or helped investigate the president's ties to Russia and his efforts to overturn the 2020 election. The order accused the firm Perkins Coie of, quote, dishonest and dangerous activity. Ooh, what a charge. And racial discrimination, just for good measure. It directed federal agencies to terminate the firm's government contracts, stripped its employees of their security clearances, and barred them from federal buildings, including courthouses. That'll be a bit of a problem. Perkins Coie and 3 other firms sued the Trump administration to block the executive orders, arguing that they violated the First Amendment, which of course they do. Dina Robinson, civil rights, as I recall, right, said one of my colleagues was pulled into working on the investigations, and every single time that this colleague pointed out factual or legal or ethical issues, the people running them just shrugged. For example, the administration was saying they wanted us to go after Perkins Coie because of Trump's commitment to ending discriminatory DEI policies. The idea of the investigation was that Perkins Coie supposedly engaged in illegal discrimination against white men. I'm sure there are no white men at Perkins Coie, right? But Perkins Coie is an extremely white firm. Only 3% of the partners are black. When my colleague pointed that out, leadership didn't care. They'd already reached their conclusion. They'd continued instructing my colleague to just find the evidence for it. Our job wasn't to engage, as she said earlier, in fact-finding investigations. Our job was to find facts that would fit the narrative that the administration already had. That is not how the division worked, or she may have said at home. That is not how this works! But I'm sure she was very professional in the office. My colleague told me that the experience demoralized and eventually broke them. It ended up being the reason that they left the Justice Department. Now, March 11th, where in the PIN section, which in part oversaw corruption cases brought by U.S. attorneys' offices around the country, was largely stripped of the authority to bring its own prosecutions. Most of the lawyers in the department were reassigned, eventually leaving only 2, down from 38 at the beginning of Trump's second term. Wow. What would be the benefit to an administration like Trump's of fully gutting the public integrity section that investigates government corruption? Well, Mike Romano again, who also did work with the January 6th group, now comments on this. At the meeting where DOJ leadership told our managers that PIN would shrink dramatically, like that's way more than dramatically, one of them said the administration didn't trust lawyers in D.C. You can imagine the level of experience it takes to prosecute complex public corruption cases. In New York, for example, the U.S. attorneys have the personnel and size and experience to do all of this work. But some U.S. attorneys' offices are much smaller. Maybe they don't have someone who has done one of these big corruption cases before. And PIN is dedicated to these cases. April 3rd, the acting U.S. attorney, I'm sorry, we missed our chance to say acting, Alina Habba, another former personal lawyer of Trump's, asked to dismiss a case against two American executives charged with authorizing $2 million in bribes to obtain a construction permit in India. Trump has long disparaged the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, because he wants to do foreign corrupt practices, which was the basis of the New Jersey case, for supposedly putting American companies at a disadvantage. The law bars any company that sells securities like stocks in the U.S. from paying bribes to foreign officials. In February, he issued an order pausing its enforcement. Later, scaled back, enforcement resumed. Oh, we're a little bit late on our break here, but at least it's the third break. That helps in the editing suite. Right, so where were we? Right, he paused the enforcement and later scaled back enforcement resumed with a smaller team. The Justice Department also disbanded the team that prosecuted foreign officials for public corruption in their countries based on money laundering in the U.S., a team that recovered hundreds of millions of dollars stolen from poor countries. Who cares about stealing from poor countries? I want to steal from poor countries. We got to let me do that. Hi, everybody. It's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and patreon.com, patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We got one more segment left, and I think we might actually make it all the way through this, I think, very important piece. I know it's not breaking news per se, but I think it's important context for understanding all of the other things happening in the news and just reinforcement for our continued attention to the issue of the assault on the presumption of regularity, which is the Trump administration's assault on it, which at this point you could also view this as, well, maybe it's time for judges to tear down this presumption. So maybe their assault on the presumption is the one we should be interested in. Depends on how you look at it, but everybody seems to be assaulting this poor thing. All right, so now we've moved on to April 3rd in our timeline, at which point Trump is issuing executive orders to pause prosecutions under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is, covers all sorts of, foreign corrupt practices, bribing officials abroad or prosecuting officials from abroad if they process and launder their ill-gotten gains in the United States. Alexis Loeb, the money laundering and asset recovery section attorney and later deputy chief of the Capitol Siege section, had this to say: there was a whole series of signals that the administration would de-emphasize the prosecution of corruption, like just generally, I guess. Our laws gave American companies cover so that they could resist shakedowns to pay bribes. And that is an interesting thing too, right? So in its best light, Trump's argument was, well, American companies are at a disadvantage. They can't pay bribes that Chinese companies are allowed to pay to local officials, so they get the contracts and Americans don't. And I mean, that's almost sensible in terms of an argument. But at the same time, the much better argument, this is cover for you. Like, you're going to be asked to pay a bribe by these guys, and they want to do business with American outfits. They want the money. They do. And they'll look for another way to structure things. And I mean, I guess if they steal it inside of their country, and then that's their country's issue to deal with. But this law is offered to you as cover. They'll ask you for a bribe. The Chinese pay me bribes. Why can't you pay me bribes? Listen, I'd love to pay you a bribe. It's illegal I'll be prosecuted in my country if I pay you a bribe. Now, that might mean that the price to the American company for doing business legitimately is higher in the end than they might offer to China, gets a sweetheart deal because they paid the bribe, but the same amount of money is coming out of pockets either way. And this way it has to all be above board and is documented and paid. And like I said, in most cases, these countries want and very much need to do business with American firms. It's not like a very small backwater economy is demanding entry into this country, and we have to make room for everybody out of fairness. They don't, but they'll want to have access to American buyers and American markets and maybe American goods in return. I don't know. It's harder for them to walk away from it. So the demand for a bribe that can be met with the insistence that it just can't be done, we just got to find some other way of doing business, is intended to be a shield, and probably works out just fine. And like I said, probably also works out cheaper in the end, if not just the same price. But okay. As Alexis was pointing out, this is a shield to resist shakedowns to pay bribes, and it's way too black and white to say that they create an uneven playing field. The laws were often used to prosecute foreign companies and individuals. People across the political spectrum saw promoting the rule of law abroad as important for promoting American interests and national security. That's important too. Good point. You could see these ideals fall away quickly in the moves the administration made, right? So no longer will America be exporting the idea of fair play, an even playing field, openness, transparency, and just letting business be the driver. We're going to bring shade into the corners again and I guess we'll stop scolding people about their interest in bribery, because we're interested in bribery too. That's just great. A prosecutor in the fraud section had to say about this situation: we were ensuring that anyone who used U.S. banking or our stock markets was complying with the law. I would meet with my foreign counterparts abroad, and they'd say this is a good form of American exceptionalism. It really did change compliance globally. I don't think anyone expected a full pause. It was so sweeping, and we were hearing all these reports of lobbying to affect how individual cases were being handled at Mar-a-Lago and elsewhere. When the New Jersey case was dismissed on the eve of trial, that showed how much we weren't in normal times anymore. All right, next up, on April 7th, when Harmeet K. Dillon, a civil liberties lawyer who has represented several conservative activists and helped Trump challenge the 2020 election results, was sworn in as head of the Civil Rights Division, which has a long history of redressing discrimination, as you might imagine. Dina Robinson, the one featured up top in the photo section, says Harmeet Dillon didn't seem to have any interest in interacting with career staff. We knew what she was saying on the radio and podcast appearances about how the career staff didn't want to do any of the work of the administration and that we needed to be cleared out. An unnamed lawyer in Federal Coordination and Compliance section under the Civil Rights Division, people had sound machines at their desks because they were convinced that everyone and everything was listening to us. It really was psychological warfare. Oh, they thought they were being surveilled at work. Julia Quinn, also from the Civil Rights Division, said leadership started dismissing racial discrimination cases. They wanted us to include language that suggested that the cases had been brought under an illegitimate theory of discrimination. Jen Swedish, the deputy chief of the employment litigation section at Civil Rights, said to demand lawyers put language in filings suggesting that we had filed frivolous lawsuits, we thought that was unethical. We worried about our bar licenses. Brian McIntyre of the Civil Rights Division said, my goal was always to become an attorney in the Civil Rights Division. Hooray, you made it, right? That was my dream. I ended up working a lot on fire department cases. In Cobb County, Georgia, for instance, we got information that even though African Americans and whites were applying for positions at about an equal rate over the previous decade, 90% of the hires had been white and 10% had been African American. And we didn't quite understand why that was. So we did an investigation and we found out that there was a credit check to get the job. You had to have a credit check that was disproportionately knocking out African Americans, particularly for student loan debt. And when we asked them why they were doing that, their response was essentially, well, if a firefighter is deeply in debt and he's fighting a fire, and he's in somebody's house, right? He might steal grandma's pearls. Wow, that's a convoluted reason. So we brought suit. In February, we got a note saying that the Attorney General wanted us to withdraw the case. The next day, division leadership insisted that we put additional language in the notice of dismissal that implied it was really all about reverse discrimination. I didn't know, quite frankly, if I could sign that. If I have to say that what I argued before was illegal, then I could have been accused of misleading the court, which could have ended up with me being disciplined, sanctioned, and my bar license revoked. So I did not sign it. My colleagues did not sign it. They pulled us all into a room, and we were all prepared to get fired because none of us were going to sign. My boss signed a modified version of the notice of withdrawal on our behalf. We also had racial discrimination cases involving the sole African-American attorney working for the Mississippi State Senate, who, during the years that she worked there, was paid less than half of what her similarly situated white colleagues were making. It was as clear-cut a case of disparate racial treatment as you could find. The Senate stalled the case until Trump's appointees could come in and order our section to drop it. When you talk about the rule of law treating people fairly and equally, that's obviously a slap in the face. Next up, some more profiles here. This one of Liz Oyer, who says, my recommendation was sought, I believe, to give a veneer of legitimacy to what was actually a political favor for a friend of the president. What's she talking about? We're now on April 7th when Liz, the former pardon attorney at the Justice Department, testified before Congress about the circumstances of her firing. Oyer, of course, lost her job after she refused to recommend restoring gun rights to the actor Mel Gibson, who had a misdemeanor conviction for domestic violence. The Justice Department said the disagreement over Gibson was unrelated to the decision to fire Oyer. And she says, in February, I was assigned to a working group that the Attorney General created to restore gun rights to people convicted of crimes. That's a bad idea for a working group, but okay. I was asked to identify suitable recipients, so I looked for people who had committed minor low-level offenses in the very distant past and demonstrated exemplary conduct in the community for many years since their conviction. The pool was narrowed to 9 people. And then I was asked to add Mel Gibson to the list. Sure, right, duh. Mel Gibson has a history of domestic violence, and I'm well aware from my experience and training that this is very dangerous for a person with a domestic violence history to possess a firearm. As Attorney General, Bondi has the power to restore rights without my blessing. My recommendation was sought, I believe, to give a veneer of legitimacy to what was actually a political favor for a friend of the president. I said I couldn't recommend restoration. And then I waited for the other shoe to drop. Not the penny, the shoe. I finally got a phone call from Paul Perkins, an Associate Deputy Attorney General. It was strongly suggested to me that Mel Gibson is someone who had a personal relationship with the president, and that I really should be all I needed to know. I felt sick. I literally did not sleep at all that night. I wrote back, still not making the recommendation. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, I was in a meeting when I learned that I was fired. My deputy told me to grab my bag and literally pulled me out of the room by my elbow and told me in the hallway that she had gotten a call. saying that there were security officers in my office waiting to walk me out of the building. I threw everything into a grocery bag and walked out of the office. I passed a lot of people I knew on the way out, and everybody was just looking on in shock. It's a very prestigious posting, the pardon attorney. Todd Blanche, the Deputy Attorney General, issued a statement saying that I was lying about the circumstances leading up to my firing. Then, I guess this is why she's a TikToker now. Then I was invited by the Democrats on the Judiciary Committee to testify in front of Congress. The administration sent armed U.S. Marshals to my home to deliver a letter warning me about testifying. Pretty democratic, I think, right? A career employee who was still at the department helped me get it called off before they got to my house, where my teenager was home alone. I felt the purpose was to intimidate me. I think you're probably right about that. You're a good lawyer. And I think it was intended to send a message to other department employees, too, who might be thinking about speaking up. I needed a lawyer. I spent the entire weekend calling all the lawyers I knew at the law firms all around D.C. Everybody I talked to was saying, thank you so much for what you're doing. We'll do whatever we can behind the scenes to support you. But nobody actually wanted to sit behind me at the congressional hearing. Nobody wanted to put their name on a letter to Todd Blanche. Yikes. Unfortunately, only Democrats attended the hearing. There were no Republicans. It has really perplexed me that there's not a shared level of bipartisan concern about what's happening inside the Department of Justice. Another good point. Now on to April 4th through 15th. At this point, a senior lawyer in the Office of Immigration Litigation, Erez Ravani, acknowledged in court that the Trump administration wrongfully deported Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a Salvadoran construction worker who lived in Maryland for 12 years, to El Salvador, where he was being held in a notorious maximum security prison. In previous administrations, including Trump's first term, the government routinely worked to get people back when they were deported without legal authority. I guess it actually happened, and we just didn't hear about it much because they corrected it. In this case, however, Bondi put Ravani on leave and then fired him. Now, the comments from David McConnell, director of the Office of Immigration Litigation, says Erez was one of the more aggressive litigators over the years. He vigorously defended Trump 1 policies. I thought he'd be the go-to person for defending them in the second term. When he got fired, everyone doing district court work thought this could happen to me. Traditionally, we didn't have a lot of turnover in the office, but now I've heard that around 60 out of the 320 attorneys have left since February. Sarah Buckley, it's not quite as bad as the public integrity section. That got hollowed out entirely. Sarah Buckley, Environment and Natural Resources Division, says when Erez Ravani got fired, that really affected morale. He was working under the gun with his clients to say, this isn't a reasonable way to proceed in court. What's a reasonable way? And they punished him for it. Ryan Crosswell from Public Integrity, to do our job, you have to be willing to do the right thing when no one is watching. If prosecutors are just going into court to win at all costs, think of all the other things taking place that you'll never know about. Now, another section, this time with a photo and comment from Sarah Buckley from Environment and Natural Resources. He was working under the gun with his clients. We just heard this one, but this is the full quote. Actually, we can skip that one because we actually heard the full quote already. It doesn't need a setup. Now, May 3rd, the Associated Press obtained an internal memo sent by Harmeet Dillon, the Trump-appointed head of the Civil Rights Division, instructing voting rights lawyers to focus on investigating voter fraud and to vigorously enforce a Trump executive order transforming how elections are run. The order purported to institute new voter ID requirements just by executive order. Forget the law. Grant dodgy access to voter data and change the rules of absentee voting and the counting of absentee ballots. All, of course, handled by the states, but to hell with it. Courts later blocked parts of that order. Anna Baldwin at the Civil Rights Division said, when the president issued his executive order related to voting, the Civil Rights Division was initially charged with defending it. But many provisions of it were an unlawful power grab under our Constitution. Congress and the states set the rules of elections, not the president. I mean, that's just true. An unnamed lawyer in the voting section at the Civil Rights Division said the Trump administration had already made us dismiss our Georgia statewide lawsuit for intentionally suppressing black votes. They didn't ask for any information about it. They just told us to dismiss it. Then they issued a press release condemning the Biden administration for bringing the lawsuit, accusing us, the line attorneys, of fabricating evidence. It was obvious they didn't look at the memo explaining what the evidence was. Another lawyer in the housing section in the Civil Rights Division said, I was detailed to work in the voting rights the voting section enforcing the National Voter Registration Act, which says states have an obligation to make sure that their voter rolls are accurate. We were tasked with obtaining states' voter rolls by suing them if necessary. Leadership said they had a dodgy person who could go through all the data and compare it to the Department of Homeland Security data and Social Security data. The idea was, we want to identify undocumented immigrants that have registered to vote. There was no pre-existing evidence that this is a problem. I had a concern that the data would be used not for purging voter rolls of people who aren't eligible to vote, but for broader immigration enforcement. I had never before told an opposing party, hey, I want this information and I'm saying I want it for this reason, but I actually know it's going to be used for these other reasons. That's dishonest. It felt like a perversion of the role of the Civil Rights Division, because it was. Next, May 12th, when a memo from FBI officials ordered field offices to devote 1/3 of their time to immigration enforcement, which meant scaling back investigations related to national security, corporate fraud, and violent crime. Gregory Rosen from Capitol Siege. The FBI had to divest serious resources from investigations of violent crime, gun and drug trafficking. Oh, I thought we were at war with them. And child exploitation. Oh, I thought that was a big deal for QAnon and MAGA, but of course, Jeffrey Epstein, now it isn't. Agents were diverted from those cases because they had to be on the street doing immigration roundups. A unnamed prosecutor in the D.C. metro area who says it's unprecedented to shift resources away from national security to this degree. Virginia and D.C. have the most important offices for counterterrorism and espionage. We get cases from the Middle East, long and complex investigations of terrorist threats from abroad and also domestically. In the Eastern District, there were 12 to 14 lawyers in the National Security Unit, and now there are 4, with no deputy, no chief. In D.C., the National Security Unit is down about 50%. I was recently on the floor where FBI agents work on domestic terrorism, and it was completely hollowed out. So, by the way, are you being protected from terrorism, domestic or foreign? Nope. Nobody working on the cases. Great. Feels good. You have to be good experience, or you have to have good experienced, trained people doing this work on a daily basis. If you don't, because you demand they do immigration shifts, there's a real danger to national security and public safety. Here, a prosecutor from Ohio says, we're in northern Ohio. I don't have an immigration problem here, but our agents, IRS and Secret Service and Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives and Immigration, I guess, we're getting detailed to Homeland Security. I was getting frustrated. We have a certain amount of time to bring charges, and often we don't find out right away when a business is committing fraud, so we may lose a year or two. Then it takes time to do these investigations. Agents have to get the records and do the interviews. We don't have time if they're riding around trying to hit daily immigration quotas, right? So they're now missing the statute of limitations in cases they could be bringing in what's supposed to be their area of expertise. May 12th, the Trump Justice Department withdrew from a consent decree with Minneapolis intended to address a pattern of racially discriminatory policing and excessive use of force based on a DOJ investigation in the aftermath of the 2020 murder of George Floyd. The Justice Department also refused to stand by the factual findings about police abuses in Minneapolis and 5 other cities, retracting them from the record. Katie Chambly-Ryan, remember her, Civil Rights Division, says, I'd left DOJ by this point. And I found out when I started getting a million texts. People were saying, I'm sorry. At first, I had no idea what they meant. I expected something bad, but it was so much more total and cruel than I imagined. The new leadership was erasing our work. Withdrawing the findings was completely unprecedented. And if you read the Minneapolis findings and the remedies we negotiated with the city, you'll see they document retaliation against journalists or civilians who film the police, use of weapons or tear gas indiscriminately in a crowd, or law enforcement agencies hiding their identities. And we're seeing federal agents do all those things now. No wonder they were trying to erase the record of DOJ findings saying that that was wrong and shouldn't be happening. There was a statement from the Justice Department in court saying you can't do these things. They took the statement away, and now the federal government is the most prominent violator. Now on to May 28th, Trump pardons a series of white-collar offenders, including Charles Scott, who had been convicted last year in Ohio of helping the chief executive of his company manipulate its stock value. We're supposed to be against that now, of course. Prosecutor in Ohio says Scott was sentenced to 42 months for a multi-million-dollar fraud. Oh, good. He can join Pervalago now. His family was wealthy. He spent all of 2 weeks in jail. That put a damper on a lot of the work we were doing to know that someone who defrauded everyday folks in Ohio was able to find a way to a pardon. Afterward, defense attorneys are telling us they can't get their clients to take good or reasonable plea offers because they felt they're better off spending their money on a political donation, drawing Trump's attention, and getting the case dismissed or going to trial and getting a pardon. That is bad news, isn't it? I don't think we've really discussed that angle of it. Alexis Loeb, money laundering and asset recovery section, says when prosecutors bring a new case, do they need to think about how the Trump administration views the defendant? Those are not the kinds of considerations prosecutors are taught they should pay attention to. Very much the opposite. That is a great point, though. People can't get decent plea agreements through because the defendants are like, screw it. I'll just get on Fox News and I'll get away scot-free. Why should I accept the plea agreement? Although you could do both, but, all right. And that may not be a bad play, right? Like, I'll plead guilty, but can I have a pardon anyway? Yeah. I don't know why they don't agree to counsel their clients that way. That works. They could normally no. But in this administration, yes. Okay, let's see if we can squeeze in one or two more here. July 9th, the Justice Department subpoenaed more than 20 doctors and hospitals that provide gender-related care to minors, including puberty suppressants, hormone therapy, and surgeries, accusing them of having, quote, mutilated children in the service of a warped ideology, unquote. Trump had already issued a series of executive orders dismantling protections for trans people, banning them from military service, and allowing open discrimination by federal workplaces. The subpoenas demanded patient information protected by privacy law. Barbara Schwabauer, Civil Rights Division, who says, it's one thing to say we're no longer going to stand up for trans people in this administration, but we're not going to file briefs in support of them. But to affirmatively go after them, I could not in good conscience continue to be a part of that. These are teenagers. An unnamed lawyer in the Federal Coordination and Compliance section at the Civil Rights Division. Under the Biden administration, the Justice Department had joined private plaintiffs in suing Alabama over its ban on gender-affirming care. Now, attorneys on the case were told by leadership to produce, on a rolling basis, all communications that they had had with all parties and each other. It felt like we were being investigated by our own office. It was very threatening and ominous. Like, what do we think they're going to do with that information? Nothing good. That's certainly true. July 11th now, Bondi fires around 20 prosecutors and support staffers who worked on the special counsel Jack Smith's investigations into Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 presidential election and his refusal to return classified documents after leaving office. One of the lawyers fired that day was Joseph Tyrell, the department's top ethics advisor. Peter Carr, senior communications advisor, says, these were support staffers, the people who helped us with managing the operations of the office or with travel arrangements and reimbursements. You have paralegals who help prepare documents for discovery. The idea that someone can be terminated from the Justice Department for a case they were assigned to work on is something that has never happened before. And at what a level, too. Now, Joseph Tyrell, director of the ethics office, says, I had done some work for Jack Smith, so I assumed that would bring some heat down on me. But in my gut, I also think they didn't want the ethics office calling them up and telling them what to do. As a federal employee, you're restricted from accepting gifts from anyone because of your position. I briefed Ms. Bondi about ethics rules, and we talked about accepting gifts from employees in the department. For the most part, leaders can't accept gifts from their subordinates. We had about a 10-minute conversation about whether or not she could accept challenge coins from offices within the department. And that seemed to me an odd thing given everything else that we have discussed, but that started to be a recurring theme with the AG's office. They didn't want to return gifts. They didn't want to not accept gifts, whatever the source. We got a request about some cigars from Conor McGregor and a soccer ball from FIFA. That one they gave to Trump, maybe, I guess. And I felt like I really had to go to the mattress to convince the AG's office you can pay for the item, or you can return the item, or you can throw the item away. There's no other way to do this. A Justice Department spokeswoman said that after consulting with ethics officials, the soccer ball, by the way, accepted on behalf of the department, and the cigars were destroyed. And then I got a call from the general counsel at the FBI about changing exceptions to the gift rules because his boss, Kash Patel, felt like he should be able to accept more expensive gifts. I reminded him that his client was not Mr. Patel, but the United States. But that didn't really get in the way of Kash Patel. Of course, that's interesting. So could you please rule on this? I'd like to get some more expensive gifts, please. Can you help me out? By the way, one of the things that have been waiting in the wings about Patel is that not only has he been using the jet to fly around the country to visit his girlfriend, but that his girlfriend now has a security detail made up of FBI SWAT officers. Just hang out with her because he may show up at any time. And of course, you don't want anybody kidnapping her. Well, it's probably a nice thing to do. So that they could blackmail Kash Patel. Why bother with that? You can just pay him a bribe. All right. We didn't make it to the end of this thing. We're now into July 12th. Oh, I'm sorry. We're now into late September at this point, at which point Trump demands the prosecution of several of his perceived political enemies. This is the Comey case, Letitia James. Eric Siebert has to resign as interim U.S. attorney for EDVA, et cetera, et cetera. So good commentary on that. It brings us up to date here. There's then entries from late October. So it's really right up to date, but we are out of time to bring you all of those stories. I think it was well worth reminding ourselves of some of those earlier stories inside the DOJ and what's going on and what it means for the presumption of regularity and the validity of presidential determinations and pardons and everything that goes along with it. Something to think about over the weekend. More to think about over the weekend if you stay tuned for Justice Putnam, who comes up next.
Radio.com.
Right here. That's the place.
You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
I know. There was a ton of things that didn't get discussed, but I think this was important background information. But now Justice will share with you what's going on with MAGA Mike Johnson, who's now pacing around the halls of the Capitol building as the Republican Party loses all support from the American people. Wouldn't that be nice? Plus more from around the country and around the world as well. Stay tuned, and we'll see you next week.